Hello there, and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what is this channel all about? Well, we talk all about the hobby. Sometimes it's hints and tips as to how to help you with your hobby. Sometimes we review codexes, sometimes we review novels, sometimes we look about the history of the hobby itself. And today we're talking about one model in particular, dreadnoughts. Dreadnoughts, they've been around for a long time. They're a classic workhorse across the Space Marine range and a few other ranges as well, to be fair to them. They've been around for a while, but they've changed a lot in that time as well, but at the same time they also haven't. And today we're going to be talking about where the classic dreadnought, the original dreadnought, fits into the current 40k canon. And for today's model, we are going to be painting this model right here. Yep, indeed, not a dreadnought, but hey ho, this is the times we live in. So, without further ado, let's crack on.
Well, let's just recap very quickly what on earth is a Space Marine Dreadnought meant to be anyway. The Space Marine Dreadnought, obviously, is a half-dead Space Marine who's been wounded almost unto death, but still has enough fight left in him that he can be surgically implanted into a massive mechanical box, given guns and giant crushing fists, and sent off to fight for the Imperium anew. Kind of almost like a double implantation. You know, a Space Marine is already genetically engineered from childhood to be a super soldier. Well, this is the next step further, when they are genetically re-engineered to go and live inside a giant box for ever and ever and ever. And the thing about the Space Marine Dreadnoughts is some of them are incredibly long-lived. Bryath, Ashmantle, and Bjorn the Fell-Handed, I believe, are the two oldest Dreadnoughts currently in the 40k canon, and both of them have been around in model form for a good few years and have quite a bit of history to themselves as well. And then there's the controversial arrival of the Murderfang on the scene a few years ago, whom we will not go into on this video. But ultimately, the thing about Dreadnoughts is that they've been around almost since the beginning, right back in Rogue Trader, in fact. They have been around in many different forms. The big blocky form that you are familiar with of the original Dreadnought, which not many people really use anymore, was probably the most familiar one to what people are used to seeing. And in many respects, that particular style of Dreadnought is the one which has informed and permeated across a lot of the designs over the years. And I think it's probably worth remembering that that Dreadnought was originally made of metal. It was a metal-heavy model for the years of 2nd and 3rd edition of 40k, and was only made into plastic around about the time of 4th edition. And you have to remember that back then, the vehicle rules were very different as well. For those of you who've only been familiar with 40k in 8th edition, vehicle rules were a very different game of soldiers, quite literally, and they didn't always sync up terribly well with the rest of the game, so thankfully we've now moved away from that. But at this time, vehicles such as the Land Raider, the Monolith, the Leman Russ, they really were the kings of the vehicular battlefield, having the highest armor, the highest damage output, and tending to also be transports as well was quite popular, hence why the Land Raider featured so prominently back then. These were very expensive, both cash and points wise, but pulling double duty both as an assault vehicle and as a gun platform really did serve vehicles such as the Land Raider back then, and definitely served things like the Leman Russ and the Monolith. But at this point you're wondering, how do heavy tanks relate to talking about the Dreadnought? Well, the Dreadnought was very much meant to be something of a walking tank in many respects. It was designed to almost match, for want of a better word, things such as the Predator or the Vindicator or the Whirlwind that were also in the Space Marine range. But the reality is that the Dreadnought just didn't really have the same amount of firepower to match them. And also, even back then, there were other walkers in other armies that ultimately stole the show a bit more. Things like the Defiler for the Chaos Space Marines, the Wraith Lord for the Eldar, were all far more interesting as far as vehicles and monsters went. And then you have to remember that going a step further, you also had things such as the Carnifex and the Greater Demons of Chaos, which all incidentally were monstrous creatures and not vehicles. And we'll get to why that's relevant later on as well. So the Dreadnought was never considered exactly the finest of the fine walking monsters of walking tanks when it came to it, but it always had a place. It was always useful as a counterattack unit, as a fairly solid head of the spear, as long as it was supported or could support another unit in turn. It had its uses, but it wasn't a game winner, so to speak. But ultimately, because there were other units and other armies that had more interesting walkers, for want of a better word, it meant that it was never very much placed at the forefront of anyone's mind. That is until, at the very least, 5th edition rolled around, and we began to see things like the Venerable Dreadnought and Ironclad Dreadnought. Now, the concept of the Venerable Dreadnought had been around since the 4th edition, but it was only really an extra rule with a few extra points attached. Whereas now, suddenly, the Venerable Dreadnought, which did receive its own model in 2006, which was metal and heavy, and I actually still have one, was a very big change to the formula. Suddenly, it was far more decorated, it was far more regal, it had a real presence on the board. And when it got its set of new rules in 2005, in the Space Marine Codex then, it very much started to make sense why it was a separate thing. And the eventual arrival of the Ironclad as a line breaker siege dreadnought that was designed to break fortresses, destroy bunkers, gave another lease on it. And at this point you have to remember there was also Forge World, and Forge World was pumping out dreadnoughts both for Space Marines and for Chaos Space Marines. It's really easy to forget nowadays that the Chaos Space Marines also had dreadnoughts that were called dreadnoughts until 2012 when they moved over to having the Hellbrute. And you have to remember that the Chaos Dreadnought was very different to the regular Space Marine Dreadnought, which is why I don't really compare the two of them. They were always a completely different style of model, and they always had a very different way of playing. But ultimately, this meant that the Dreadnought was beginning to expand. There was becoming more of them. And also, we began to see things such as the Chaplain Dreadnought from Forge World, and lots of chapter-specific Dreadnoughts that had their own weapons that Forge World provided as well. So to summarise very quickly, whilst the Dreadnought, even up till 10 years ago, had multiple iterations, they were all still iterations on the same core design. The big blocky model with one gun arm or one melee arm or two melee arms or two gun arms was all very much what the dreadnoughts revolved around. And even though there was lots of changes in aesthetic, you had dreadnoughts for the Thousand Sons, for the Word Bearers, for the Alpha Legion, on the Chaos side of things that were still called dreadnoughts. You also had dreadnoughts for the Dark Angels, for the Space Wolves, for the Ultramarines and the Black Templars on the Forge World side of things, and of course the Dark Angels. Now, whilst things like Bjorn the Fell-Handed, which was the dreadnought special character for the Space Wolves, had his own metal model, that very much meant that he was staying there for a little while longer and didn't change too much. But by this point, obviously, we're only talking about having lots of the same kinds of dreadnoughts, even though we, at this point, have a dreadnought, which was the basic dreadnought, the Venerable Dreadnought, which is meant to be a more upscaled, more veteran dreadnought, for want of a better word, and the Ironclad Dreadnought, which fulfilled a very specific task. But lots of iterations of that specific model across both Forge World and Games Workshop. So what was the change? When did we suddenly go from having 3 dreadnoughts to having millions? Well, you know what I mean. And the answer for that is twofold. First of all, as I say in many other things, the Horus Heresy was the first change. Suddenly, Forge World releases the Contempt Dreadnought, and it also then releases the Dredeo Dreadnought and the Leviathan Dreadnought. Now, these dreadnoughts, thankfully, have very much remained in resin, and it seems like they will remain in resin at least for the time being. Ultimately, that meant that dreadnoughts could be more. And the thing about dreadnoughts at this time, you have to remember, at least through the years of 6th and 7th edition, the thing you have to remember about all these dreadnoughts as well is that in the game, like I said, they were very much a support unit. They weren't really what you'd call the tip of the spear. But this was partly to do with the limitations in the rules, and ultimately vehicles up until 6th edition at least, only having one what you would classify as a wound in the form of the hull point system. And as I've said in previous videos, the hull point system was probably the weakest vehicles have ever been, and I am very glad that it is gone. But even back then, people were saying that it didn't really make sense gameplay-wise for dreadnoughts to be vehicles. Really, they should be monstrous creatures. Give them an armor save. Because you have to remember that a few vehicles had invulnerable saves, but none of them had armor saves. And this weakened a lot of vehicles, but light vehicles especially were weakened by the fact they had no real protection against any sort of incoming heavy weapons fire, and dreadnoughts were no different. So here we are in 6th edition, maybe even 7th edition, where we have dreadnoughts as vehicles with a middling level of capacity, with maybe 1 or 2 ways of playing them, which was a bit more adventurous. The only saving grace they had in the years between 5th and 7th edition is at least they could go into drop pods, at least they could deep strike onto the board and get straight into the thick of it, where they had a slightly better chance if they were in the right situation. But then of course, when it came to 8th edition, everything changed again, and dreadnoughts finally became what they should have been all along. Large vehicles, but they had a toughness characteristic, they had wounds, they had a save, and with a Duty Eternal rule, became even more hardy than they were before. And this benefited them immensely. But by this point, we find ourselves with a very different kind of dreadnought around. So I've skipped over a little bit, so I'll rewind back. You may remember that I mentioned the Dredeo Dreadnought, the Leviathan Dreadnought, the Contemptor Dreadnought. Well, the Contemptor Dreadnought, for one thing, eventually made its way into plastic in about 2015-2016 time in the Betrayal at Calth kit, and that sent people absolutely crazy. The Contemptor kit was incredibly popular, and still is to this day, in spite of the plastic version at least having very limited weapon options. Now, this can be mitigated with stuff from the Forge World side of things, but that's a bit of a tangent. Ultimately, it meant that there was now another dreadnought on the board as well. And then you have to remember that these were the dreadnoughts that were available to everyone. If we go into the chapter-specific dreadnoughts for a second, things were even more varied. The Blood Angels have always had their own approach to dreadnoughts, being able to have not just a regular dreadnought, but also the Furioso dreadnought, which is a close combat dreadnought, the Death Company dreadnought, and the Librarian dreadnought, which is a psychic dreadnought. And for the Librarian dreadnought, that was unique. We'd never had that really before, at least not in Space Marines. But the fact that the Blood Angels and their successors could have it was something which was a big deal, and arguably still is, even though it has somewhat fallen by the wayside. So here we are in about mid-2016, where suddenly, along with those additional dreadnoughts, the Dreadnought, the Venerable Dreadnought, and the Ironclad, we've got the Forge World Dreadnoughts that are also still around, along with now the Contemptor, the Dredeo, the Leviathan, along with the Death Company Dreadnought, the Furiosa Dreadnought, and the Librarian Dreadnought. That's a lot of dreadnoughts. That's a lot of different types of model. So where does the regular dreadnought fit into all of this, and what's the purpose of it at this point? Well, the purpose of it at this point was basically to be a cheaper alternative model for people who hadn't bought a Venerable Dreadnought yet, unfortunately, and this was sadly the case. The basic Dreadnought simply lacked the close combat strength of the Ironclad, it lacked the firepower of the Venerable, and when you put it next to things like the Blood Angels and the Space Wolves, who had access to their own kinds of dreadnoughts by this point, there was no real reason to take it as such. The only time you'd ever see a regular dreadnought on the board at this time was very much if you had 100 points spare and you had literally nothing else to put on the board in your army. And even then, people would still pony up for something else rather than going for a dreadnought. So when I say 8th edition really did help them, I really do mean it helped them. But in my opinion, it came a little bit too late to really rehabilitate the dreadnought, because eventually we suddenly had the Redemptor Dreadnought appear on the scene, and a little while after that the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, which really did give the game away that you don't have to be half dead to pilot a walking tank. You can be perfectly alive and healthy and just sit in the control seat. But anyway, that's just what happened afterwards and after the fact. So to summarise very quickly as to where we've landed so far, dreadnoughts have been around by this point for over 20 years and have almost as many iterations of the same. Even though a lot of them stick to the same idea, ultimately what separates them is battlefield role. And now this gets me on to the next point in this story. The battlefield role of a dreadnought, as I said earlier, was always a support role for the original dreadnought. Even the Venerable Dreadnought, I'd argue, to this day still has a similar role. But things like the Ironclad, which was far more specific as a close combat dreadnought, as was the Space Wolves Venerable Dreadnought with its massive axe and storm shield, as was the Death Company Dreadnought, as was the Furiosa Dreadnought. These were all either close combat or close support dreadnoughts that weren't designed just to be a supporting unit that could do a bit of everything. The Dredeo Dreadnought from Forge World and the Leviathan were both very specifically almost designed to be gun platform dreadnoughts, if not incredibly powerful close combat dreadnoughts. And that was the difference between the Forge World Dreadnoughts for a very long time and the Games Workshop Dreadnoughts. The Games Workshop Dreadnoughts couldn't specialise the same way the Forge World ones could into having one battlefield role or another. And so this leads us on to the question, when you have so many dreadnoughts with so many battlefield roles, where does that leave the basic dreadnought? What does it do? And what does it do today? Well, what it really does today is two things, two very specific things. It does two things that are very useful, actually, thinking about it. First of all, it provides a very good points filler for getting mobile firepower into a Space Marine army. Even though that you can have tanks that can run around with heavy weapons, they are targets, and they can't do much in combat. The regular dreadnought can still have assault cannons, multi-melters, twin las cannons, heavy bolters, and all the rest of that for a relatively low price and still be useful in combat. And dreadnoughts have gotten much better in combat and are far more survivable than they used to be, even at the cheaper end of things. And this has benefited them greatly because it means that rather than just being able to bring very limited support to another unit, they are now more adept at standing up on their own. Obviously, most weapons that are designed to kill tanks will definitely kill a dreadnought, so they aren't going to be immune to everything, but they definitely have a purpose in the game which is more supported in 8th and 9th than it was before. But then again, to think back is that if you spend more points, you can get another dreadnought that's more specific. So what's the other purpose of the dreadnought? The other purpose of the dreadnought, to my mind, the basic dreadnought at least, is to be something of a linchpin for your army that it doesn't lean upon, but definitely can support. So in some respects, the role of the dreadnought really has come full circle, back to where it was before. It's back to being a support unit first and foremost, rather than being the spearhead or the heavy firepower unto itself. And ultimately, I'd say that's a role it suits better. After all, it is one model, and having one model rather than an unwieldy unit that needs to move around the board, being able to support your army as and when it needs, is ultimately far more useful to a Space Marine player than it is to anyone else. And if we then shift our perspective to the Chaos Space Marines with their Hell Brutes, And their Hellfire Dreadnoughts that from Forge World is that they've carved out an identity that's completely unique to them now and can't really be compared to the old Dreadnoughts that they used to have up until 5th edition or 6th edition. But for all those Space Marine players that still have their old plastic Dreadnoughts from the early 2000s with his 3 weapons, one of which was a fist, the other were all guns, it's still something to note that that model has come through a lot over the years, and ultimately, in spite of all the rules changes, has largely stayed the same in terms of its battlefield role. Even though it arguably is not the most exciting unit on the board, it can become a very interesting centerpiece for your army. But ultimately, having one is always still a useful thing to have, and they've never stopped being useful, which is the interesting thing. Even if there are other things out there that do better in specific circumstances, the basic Dreadnought is in many respects still very much a solid support unit, and the fact that it's managed to maintain that and not lose itself into one role or another shows how grounded it has been, but also simultaneously how inspirational in some respects it's been to form so many spin-offs and so many specialised versions of itself that it makes you wonder really if it's the Dreadnought that changed or if it was the pilot that changed from edition to edition, or maybe the idea is that Dreadnoughts move from one chassis to another depending entirely on the circumstances they need to be. Now that's a lore-specific question, but it's worth thinking about. But in gameplay terms very specifically, Dreadnoughts, the basic Dreadnought at least, will always be a good support, and if you need him to be more than that, then you know that he's got cousins that he can call upon quite easily. But let me know your thoughts below in the comments. What do you think of the basic Dreadnought? Do you think that they are still perfectly fine and usable? Do you think they have been completely surpassed? Do you think they should go away now? Do you think that we've got enough other Dreadnoughts that we only need specialised versions now? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you.
So those are my thoughts on where the Dreadnought is in the contemporary 9th edition 40k canon, shall we say, and what its place is and the sort of things it's able to do with itself at the moment. But I hope you found that interesting, and let me know your thoughts below, and whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. And whilst you're down there, check out my website, see what kind of services I provide, have a look at my Patreon, and just have a look at some of the toy soldiers that I have painted over the years on my Instagram account. But again, thank you all very much for watching. New videos on Wednesday. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.